daawadayaal kusoo dhawaada barnaamijkan aanu ku wareysanayno safiiradda fadhida dalka Ingiriiska Somalia Ambassador Harriet Mathews iyo dad aqoon-yahano wariyaal iyo aqoon-yahanin halkan jooga oo ayagu su'aalo weydiin doona ku saabsan xaaladda electionka Soomaaliya security iyo umuraha kale oo ummadda Soomaaliyeed la xiriira iyo wixii aan ummadda Soomaaliyeed mustaqbalkooda iyo masiirkooda u noqon lahaa iyadoo lagu jiro xilliga kala guurka marka ugu horeysa waxaan jecelahay ambassadorda inaan kusoo dhaweeyo si ay update noo siiso waxa dalkii hooyo ka dhacay. So thank you very much for being with us once again. Could you update us where we are at?
Thank you very much. So it's been a really busy few months. On the political front, obviously we've got a decision, first of all the presidential decree, and then the regions deciding on taking forward elections and the model that they would follow. There's been a lot of work as well on the detail of that. There's been progress too on the security side, with more Somali National Army being biometrically registered, with the agreement of a national security policy. And then for the UK as well, it's been a busy period. So we've had a visit by the UN Security Council, the Foreign Secretary also visited for the first time. And right before I came away for my holiday, we had the Queen's birthday party as well, with the Prime Minister and a lot of the Cabinet represented there as well. So a really busy few months.
Right, great. If we go to the first question.
My question is in regards to as a diaspora member who's quite young and very much active and involved in current affairs in Somalia and all of that, what can we do to impact positively the security situation in Somalia in regards to whether it's supporting the UK establishment, including yourself, or whether supporting the federal Somali government? That's my question.
We all know that the Somali soldiers are paid very little, sometimes go months without being paid. What is Britain and its partners doing to ensure that the Somali soldiers are paid to keep the spirit going? And yeah, that's my question.
So let me first answer the question about what we're doing to support the Somali National Army and Somali soldiers. And I agree with you, it's really important that if you're trying to fight Al-Shabaab, then your army needs to be paid regularly, and it needs to be paid enough, and it needs to be fed and have the basics. So the UK is focusing most of its efforts on Sector 3. So we're in Southwest State and we're in Jubaland State. And there we've been paying stipends to the soldiers on the front line, so $100 a month, making sure that the soldiers receive the money. We're doing biometric testing to make sure there aren't ghost soldiers and that they get the money regularly. We're also working to make sure that they've got the equipment that they need. Sometimes when people are in the fight, we don't realise that they don't even have boots or belts or uniforms. So we focus a lot on things like that, rain ponchos, we've had really heavy rains lately, tents, really basic equipment for them as well. So that's the main area that we've been focusing on helping the soldiers, but we've also obviously been working at the federal level to try and make sure that there are deeper reforms built in so that the army is sustainable into the future and that the plans there are right. So we're also doing, for example, training in communication and making sure that the army has the ability to communicate with other battalions who are nearby or with AMISOM as well. I think the question of then what the diaspora can do is absolutely great and a really fundamental one, and it matters a lot to me because in my day-to-day life I see British diaspora, but also from Canada, Australia, from Sweden, the Netherlands, who really put their lives on the line to try and make Somalia a better place. And I don't think you have to be fighting or working in the security sector to really be tackling security. If you are someone who is employing people or helping make Somalia a more prosperous place, a more transparent place, who's helping to build institutions, which is what will take Somalia into the future, then I think you're contributing towards security. And then finally, just in the messaging that you send out, whether it's on TV as we're here today, or whether it's on your social media account, I think it's really important to be positive about Somalia and the future that it can and will have, and also to make sure you don't tolerate hate talk and the sort of attitude and hatred that comes from terrorism. So Somalia has fantastic potential, and one of the best potentials it has is you, who are educated, informed, and who really care about the country.
AMISOM troops are in Somalia right now, and they're supposed to be there to help bring stability. We've had reports where AMISOM themselves are selling weapons in the black market, and the same people that we trust to bring stability and peace to Somalia are doing this. So my question is, how much confidence do you have in AMISOM, and are they really there to bring peace, or are they there because they want a paycheck?
So I think this is it's another really good question, and in every army, in every part of the world, you're going to find some people who are there for the wrong reasons. So you get corrupt soldiers in the British Army, and we've seen that. And the important thing is that we have means that we hold them to account, and you remove them from that situation. And similarly, there may be soldiers who are there because their motivation is to have a paycheck to pay for their family. The issue is whether they're bringing stability, and whether, as a whole, the countries and their leaders have the right motivation. It's really clear to me that, yes, there have been some examples of corruption, and there have been, in the past, certainly some terrible examples where there have been attacks on the local population. And I think AMISOM has done quite a lot to try and tackle that. Overall, though, without AMISOM there, and these are people putting their lives on the line, and we've seen the casualty figures from some of the countries, we wouldn't have a Somalia where we could operate the way we are. So we're investing in the Somali National Army, but it's taking time. And the fact that AMISOM is there, that it's taking hits from Al-Shabaab, that it's fighting and taking the fight to Al-Shabaab, means that there is that space for the Somali National Army to be built, and that there is that space for the institutions to grow as well. So I think it's really important not to take the few examples and believe that the whole of AMISOM, it looks like that, even though those are the stories that are in the paper. There are stories of real heroism there. There are some really good stories about cooperation. So again, nearby Doha, there have been some really good stories where the Somali National Army have gone into a fight, have called for help, and AMISOM have come in and supported them in the fight. And there's real partnership, and that's what we need to build.
You mentioned about the British troops and ways to deal with when there's corruption or crime committed by the soldiers. AMISOM soldiers, they operate outside the Somali jurisdiction. So when they commit crime in Somalia, whether it's raping young girls, whether it's stealing other people's property or what have you, there is no ways or means the Somali government can deal with them, because they have no control over them. So how do you bring to justice soldiers who commit atrocities in Somalia, in particular the Ethiopian troops?
So I won't focus on one country, because I think the same thing applies to all of them. But I've certainly spoken in very frank terms with the SRCC, and he's given a very clear commitment to me about holding AMISOM troops to account. And I think most recently we saw a case of some troops who were arrested for selling off petrol. And I think that's a really strong example, and it's really important that it's been publicly reported, that everyone can see that there is going to be some action, and now there needs to be the follow-up as well.
Right. Regarding the rebuilding of Somali National Army, if they're not getting paid, they're not getting trained on equipment that they need to have in order to serve the country and make sure that we're all safe, wouldn't it be better if the AMISOM troops reduced and the funding directed to Somali National Army? So you have a Somali National Army building a lot more faster than it is at the moment, because last 4 years it's been the same. Nothing has changed.
So I think it's tempting to say that that would be the quick fix. If you move the money here and you put it there, then magically the Somali National Army will exist and work. It's more complicated than that. So yes, we certainly are shifting our resources and making sure more and more whether it's on the training, whether it's on the equipping, whether it's on the political front, is going towards the Somali National Army. And that's a policy decision that we've taken. But I don't think it's just about money. The problem really is that to build an army, you need to have an agreed plan, and you need to know what size it's going to be, what threat it's actually tackling, how it's going to be distributed across the country, and that needs to be agreed by everyone. And it's a very political requirement, and it's taken time to have the sort of space to have that discussion and that agreement. So in the last leadership forum, there was an agreement on the threat assessment, and as I said, there was an agreement on the national security policy, which is still quite broad, and that needs to now come into more detail about what does the army look like. Is it a federal army where do you have an equal division or a 4.5 division of its members, or do you have it more locally based because that's more flexible? So you need to agree the plan as well as investing in the equipment and in the salaries and the stipends. And I think finally, what Somalia builds has to be sustainable. So if the international community pays a vast amount for an enormous army with the best equipment for a year or two, what happens in 3 years when Somalia is trying to stand on its own feet and can't afford it? So you also need to plan to have something that's effective but sustainable into the long term as well.
Right. I'll take the microphone, please.
Is there a actual timetable for an exit strategy?
No, there isn't an exit strategy with a timetable attached to it, but I think that that has become a really important factor. So we've all heard in the news stories about, Uganda wanting to withdraw, wanting to have an exit strategy, Kenya, others in the region as well, and I think that's natural. It costs them money to be in Somalia, it costs them lives, and it's not always a popular decision to be in another place. So I think it's vital that there is an exit strategy and that has clearly laid out markers which sets out what AMISOM has to do, but also what the Somali security services need to do as well.
Just a quick one before I give to the guys at the back. We know the AMISOM AMISOM's force come to Somalia under the United Nations mandate. Under what mandate the Ethiopian troops are deployed in Somalia?
So the mandate at the moment has wording which talks about AMISOM and its strategic partners. So under that language, it would be possible for strategic partners to be deployed as well. Obviously, this depends on consent of the government as well.
Government of Somalia. Also, you talked about how wonderful, how AMISOM working hard and losing lives, which is true, and we know that their camps been attacked several times. But 22,000 of them are in Mogadishu, in Somalia, mainly in Mogadishu. Yet we've seen waves of attacks Al-Shabaab carried out. One is the one just we saw 2 weeks ago. Half a dozen people lost their lives. Do AMISOM soldiers fail to keep Mogadishu alone safe, let alone the rest of the country?
Look, it's really easy to talk about failures in an environment like Somalia, and it's really difficult living there. And while we're talking about it, that event was a terrible attack with close friends, I'm sure, of yours, but certainly of mine as well, caught up in it. In Somalia at the moment, there's asymmetric attacks by Al-Shabaab, and it's very difficult to defend against asymmetric attacks if someone wants to carry them out. We saw that even in Brussels, we've seen it in Paris, we've seen it just over the last couple of days in Orlando. So there will always be a risk of those spectacular, difficult events if people are determined enough and want to carry them out. And so I don't think it's right to be saying it's AMISOM's fault or the Somali National Army's fault or even NISA's fault unless
someone has to take responsibility.
Unless you can see sort of gross negligence. I think what is important is seeing that in Mogadishu, what's been really impressive over the last few months is seeing the Somali authorities performing better. So over the last few weeks, we've seen, I think, 5 different vehicle-borne devices which have been intercepted in Mogadishu. So yes, there was one attack. I don't want to say successful attack. It was a horrible, disgusting attack. But meanwhile, another half a dozen of them have been thwarted. And that was because of the success of NISA and the police, which is brilliant news. Now, AMISOM is focused more out of, there are some in Mogadishu, preserving, for example, the airport infrastructure and the main infrastructures around the ministries and Villa Somalia. And it's very difficult to estimate what a success is if it's something that hasn't happened. But I think certainly if you look at the attacks on Villa Somalia in the past, even on the airport in the past, there may always be something that happens, but actually those have been very well protected indeed, and those are critical pieces of infrastructure which Mogadishu and Somalia needs to continue. So is there room to do more? Absolutely. But we're not in the situation that we were in before, where AMISOM was coming in and pushing out. Holding ground is very different and very difficult to do if you've got an enemy that wants to have asymmetric attacks. So I think, praise the successes, but absolutely let's look at ways that we can do more, both with AMISOM but also in the Somali security services as well. And the more that they can do, the better the success, and again, for the longer term, the better for Somalia.
Okay.
Another question about the security.
My name is Abdisalam Harari, Universal TV. I just want to ask you 1 or 2 questions about the security. What we have on the ground in Somalia now is AMISOM and the Somali government troops controlling the major cities, Mogadishu, Kismayo, and all the rest, and Al-Shabaab still roaming around the countryside. They are effectively in control of very, very large parts of the country, still taxing people, still exporting charcoal, still making money in one way or other. So how do you see the second phase of the Somali security situation? It has been like this for the last few years now. Is it going to stay like this? What's your opinion? Another second question, please. We know British troops are on the ground in Somalia, and Britain, in the recent history of Somalia, was one of the major powers that didn't contribute any troops. In the early 90s, Operation Restore Hope, when there was 30,000 international troops in Somalia, of course led by the Americans. We know the situation is different now, but is it likely there will be an increase of British troop numbers in Somalia? And do you see in the near future the operation in Somalia turning from AU-led to a UN-led?
And that was about 7 questions packaged as 2, and they were really good questions as well. So let me answer the British troop questions first. So the first thing to say is the British troops are not there actively fighting. They're not doing the sorts of roles that you're seeing with AMISOM. What they're there to do is to help support AMISOM and the Somali National Army as well, looking at things like training, infrastructure, supply routes, making sure roads are kept open so that supplies can reach the troops that need them. So they're more in a supportive role, and we're using our troops because they're able to go to risky environments and because they're very effective at what they do. In terms of numbers, we're talking between 40 to 70 going up and down, and at the moment there are no plans to increase that. The role of the UK, though, I think just to say, in Somalia is absolutely confirmed, and I think the presence of these troops coming out, the fact that we've got an embassy in Mogadishu, is a sign of our long-term commitment to Somalia, so don't expect that to fade at all. In terms of the other question about security, so what's going to happen over the next few years and what changes, I think this is the thing that we have to grapple with and that we're trying to work out with Somali government and with the regions as well. Fundamentally, what needs to change, I think, is that if people really don't get any benefit from Al-Shabaab, so at the moment they're able to recruit people because they're paying them. I think our experience is that most of the foot soldiers in Al-Shabaab are not there because of a great belief, they're there because it's a job. So one of the things that we really need to do is to boost prosperity in Somalia, make sure that there are jobs that people can go to so that they're not attracted by Al-Shabaab or by crossing the Mediterranean in very dangerous conditions or by going into piracy as in the past or crime. So there's a really strong economic imperative, which is one of the reasons that our development programme is focused on that. I mean, there's a desperate need in Somalia. And I think the other thing is that if you look in the rural areas, often it's very small groups of Al-Shabaab who are collecting taxes, 5 people, 10 people. You don't need to deploy a whole army that way. But I think if communities, and where communities decide that they really don't want to tolerate this anymore, they can do a lot themselves to try and protect themselves. And I hope that we'll see more of that as well.
Let's take 2 more questions or 3 for Security Mohammed and then Zakaria.
I think we can all agree there's been a substantial development, politically, economically. I mean, the fact that we're talking about elections, it shows where we are. But I think if we look at the example of Afghanistan, where there's been a 10-year of terrorism and Taliban, there was a negotiated settlement somewhere, brokered by Doha, on the international community, I should say. The context is Somalia is in a position where we've got homegrown terrorism, but also outside terrorism. Has there been any assessment done on what negotiations or reconciliation that can be done or can be negotiated with some of them? Because I'm looking at a situation where Somaliland has dealt with them accordingly, and Puntland is also the same. Kismayo, has there been any assessment to say what is the law for them to bomb Mogadishu only and Kismayo, the towns near Mogadishu? What I'm saying here is, if enough investment and resources are given to Somali troops, then they can enter these villages, talk to these people, and hold on to these particular spaces. And Amazon can do that, but the Somali people and the troops who speak the Somali language, know the culture, can do that. And that's how to root out, I believe, Shabab. So for me, it's an issue of resources. So how can that be allocated a lot quicker and also more sufficiently to the Somali troops? Thank you.
I think one thing that Somalia desperately needs today is a support for its justice system. There was a promise from the British government that it would help Somalia with building prisons, and I think that was back in about 2 years ago. Had that promise been overseen?
So very quickly, a few responses. First, we're working with AMISOM in particular to make sure that newly recovered areas get a fast injection of support, and that's with the UN as well. So if an area is liberated, that there's a lot of immediate support that comes in so that people can see a dividend from being under the control of the government rather than Al-Shabaab. And I think that's really important. So I hope that answers at least part of your question. Lots of questions from you, so let me try and remember all of them. On justice, absolutely vital. So justice is really important on everything, whether it's about investing in Somalia and knowing you've got rule of law, or whether it's about feeling secure. So we have a criminal justice advisor who works in our embassy, who's been working and training judges and prosecutors. And yes, we did build 2 prisons. One of them is in Garowe, one of them is in Hargeisa, and they are of international standard, which is really important as well. So some really important work there. On Dadaab, we've been really strong in our engagement with Kenya. So when the Foreign Secretary visited just a week ago, when the Security Council visited just over 2 weeks ago, and in all of our engagement, we've made absolutely clear that Kenya must adhere to its international obligations, and that there is a security impact of closing Dadaab. So it has to be worked through and made sure that there is definitely a process to receive people who want to return, and that can be accelerated, but that you can't just forcibly close the camp in that way. I think one of the things which is really exciting though is that many of those who've been brought up in Dadaab have got great educations, who are really skilled in different areas, and I hope that they can come to Somalia and bring something really positive to Somalia in terms of the skills that they've learnt and the background that they've got. And I understand that already over 13,000 people have returned voluntarily, most of those just within the last couple of months. So there definitely is a demand of people wanting to come back to Somalia so that they can see the opportunities as well.
Yeah, there's one more question regarding security. Two hands. Can we take Saeed first, please?
Reducing asymmetric attacks is having a very strong central agency that gathers data and acts upon that data. Is there any effort from British government in supporting or establishing in the future a independent Somali central agency that contributes?
My question is the legitimacy. What is the legitimacy of frontline countries who invited themselves in Somalia under AMISOM umbrella, and those who even some people are arguing that they are outnumbered than the number registered under the AMISOM umbrella?
So there is a national intelligence agency, so there is a security agency in Somalia which exists already, but I think, and the UK is definitely standing ready to help where it can. I think the most important thing that we can have though in Somalia is counter-terrorism legislation passed. So there is a terrorism bill which has been before Parliament. It hasn't been passed yet, and that's really important for providing a legal base for countries like the UK, but others as well, to provide the sort of support that Somalia needs. So at the moment, Somali legislation is very, very old, and it's not up to date with the sorts of crimes that you have at the moment. It was written before you had mobile phones, before you had the current systems of financing. So that would be a really big start that Somalia can provide to get even more support for its intelligence. Just on the SNA, absolutely, in terms of paying regularly, it's not just the UK in one sector paying stipends. The US, the UAE are paying stipends as well, and we're working really closely with them to make sure we're coordinating, and it's the soldiers who are there, who are registered and whose names we have, who are getting the money. And we now need to make sure they're also the ones who are doing the fighting, so that it's those who are on the front line risking their lives who are rewarded. And we've been very clear in all of our engagements with the government that paying the soldiers is the first duty. It's one of the basics that a government has to do, and I think they've responded to that. Legitimacy of AMISOM, I know it's absolutely controversial about having neighbours in a country, but the legitimacy is provided by the mandate that you have both from the AU and the UN. So that's where it sits.
Great. On the issue of security, we're going to leave there and move to another subject matter, which is the election, which is very hot, and I'm sure everyone is aware of. But before that, I'd just like to end with this security topic. Puntland and Galmudug soldiers, they defeated Al-Shabaab successfully without any help from AMISOM, and that shows if the Somali soldiers are equipped, they can do the job. So let's have faith on them.
Good point.
Thank you. The school election, question on election. Young lady at the back.
I'd like to thank you for having us. So in a country with over kind of half of the population being women, and a climate whereby women are making advancements in education and want to kind of readily engage in the political discourse, how do you think we can engage these women within the elections, in politics and beyond?
Rule, I think there was about 30% was reserved for women as well. Yeah. So will this be implemented this time around as well?
So I think it's really important that at the Leadership Forum, they agreed that they would hold 30% quota for women, both in the upper house, explicitly in the communique, but we were also told that in the discussions they also agreed that for the lower house. And this has been a really important part of my work in Somalia. Some people have said to me, you're exporting British values to Somalia, and this is, why is the West so obsessed with this? But actually, it's something that I've heard from a lot of Somali women who say, we want to have a voice, we want to have a vote, and we also want to see women in positions of authority. But at the moment, the whole of the system means that we don't actually have a means to do that. Also, if you look at sort of international studies, they've shown that the more women participate in politics, the better the results are, in particular in fragile states and states which are coming out of conflict. So the higher the proportion of women, the more likely you are to have peace agreements that last, the more likely you are to have reconciliation that actually works. So what are we doing about it? This is the big question. So from the UK side, first of all, being really clear in what we expect, doing a lot of lobbying and campaigning of both the regional leaders, of the federal government, of all politicians to make sure they're clear on what our expectations are. We're trying to work with civil society groups as well to make sure that they can get out to different parts and regions, and that they can also find and encourage people to actually stand, because if you don't have candidates, then you're not going to get your 30% either. But I think it is going to be a really tough issue. I think it's one that isn't universally popular. People like it in theory, but if they have to give up their own position in order to make space for a woman, then it's not so popular. And so I think it's really important that everyone, women, but also and especially men, make clear that this is something that they want as well and that they support. Thanks.
Great. On election, we know the President Hassan, a while back, he said that he's going to be standing for this election as a candidate. We also heard unconfirmed, I should say, a report that saying also the Prime Minister is candidate, which we cannot confirm on this program. If that is the case, how come they both in charge the election process? Isn't that a conflict of interest?
Well, I think inevitably in a situation like this, and in the UK, you can have the Prime Minister or the incumbent standing again, and people will accept it if they trust the system. And that's why it's so important to get the system right. So we've been focusing a lot now on the composition of the technical committee that's going to be taking forward the election and making some of the day-to-day decisions on how it's going to be conducted. It's why the dispute resolution mechanism becomes so important. And it's also why as you need a system of observation and seeing what role civil society and the international community are going to play in providing the checks and balances that you need. So I think we're all clear that this isn't the one person, one vote that we hoped for. It's really important that we have one person, one vote for 2020 and that we carry on working towards it. And it won't be a perfect system. But if we can get some of those other technical points right and the right people there watching, then I think it helps. In some ways, I think it's always helpful if you have two of them standing, as you say, not confirmed yet, but then that also provides a little bit of oversight as well.
Right. Somalia back on its feet. Somali youth make up 75% of the population. They are mainly underrepresented. The current parliament is mainly occupied by elderly people, whether they are males or females. So what effort is the UK government making in making sure that, equally like the women quota, which I completely appreciate, a youth quota, whether it's women or youth, is ring-fenced so that we don't just see bald heads and basically elderly people representing the large proportion of the Somali population. Thank you very much.
So first of all, your office, does it have a representation in Hargeisa, or only deal with Somali federal? That would be my first question. And the second thing, and obviously there's a lot of things happening in Somaliland. There's an election which is due in 2017. Britain obviously is part of the donors who are actually funding the program, as well as the registration program, fourth registration program actually. So we often hear the official line of the British basically is that you're supporting the Somali integrity in terms of as a country basically, but at the same time, you're directly dealing with Somaliland and have a representation in there. So is this a double standard to Somaliland as far as we see there's a Somaliland diaspora in here? So if you want to brief us about what's happening and the progress of those things that you've been funding your government. Thank you.
So the embassy is based in Mogadishu, but we want to make sure that we provide the support that we need to Somaliland. And so we have coverage which comes from Addis Ababa because it's a shorter, convenient flight. So there are political officers who work to me who are based in Addis Ababa, just as I have other ones who work in Nairobi, working on, for example, development and our support staff. And in terms of Somaliland, I think we will always have a really special relationship with Somaliland, and that's why it's so important to be present. And the UK, along with the EU and Denmark, has funded the voter registration process there, which is one of the most modern and advanced in the world with iris recognition system. We've been working there to make sure that it's not just about registration, it's also about education, it's about the vote itself. And we've also been working on a range of other issues in Somaliland, for example, on the recent droughts, and then on wider support to the government there, making sure that they have health support, education support, security as well with the Coast Guard. So it's right across the piece. It's a very rich relationship, just as it is with the federal government as well in Mogadishu. I mean, I look at Somaliland and I think it sets a fantastic example of what you can achieve in the rest of Somalia. And I think that's something which is laudable and that we should be holding up as a real example. In terms of the UK and recognition, because I think that's what you're really asking, I think our position is really well known. So we need to follow what the AU says. If we said we recognise Somaliland, it wouldn't mean anything. It has to be part of a proper deal. And I know that there are talks continuing between Hargeisa and Mogadishu at the moment, which we follow very closely indeed.
And in the diaspora. One of their main worries is obviously the level of corruption, but also who the burden will fall on tomorrow. So Somalia is constantly getting into more and more debt. All the money, whether it's international aid, relief, or capacity building, all the loans that we're getting is debt that the next generation has to pay. And this is one of the biggest worries of young Somali people, is that not only there's a current mismanagement, but this current mismanagement, will actually have a direct impact on the future and burden them even more before they even get started on how they're going to pay back all this money. And as you also mentioned, that Somalia is at the bottom of the list in the World Index of Corruption. So this takes me to my final question, is knowing that the people you're dealing with on the ground are unbelievably corrupted, and knowing that you're giving the money to them, would the Somali young people tomorrow still be held accountable for that debt?
Great question, great to look at the future. So at the moment, Somalia can't borrow money on the big international financial markets because of the situation that it's been. So it's heavily indebted, but it can't borrow anymore. And that's because of the lack of institutions and systems within Somalia. So one of the really big pieces of good news, which sounds very technical but is really important for Somalia, is that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has started something which they call a staff monitored program in Somalia. And what that does is it sets really clear targets for Somalia to meet in terms of its public financial administration and institutions. So for example, it's got to have particular plans on poverty, or it's got to have clear financial flows. It's got to be able to afford what it's spending. So one of the reasons why the Somali National Army has to be paid is because if it's not paid, Somalia won't meet its requirements under that SMP. So it's a really important piece of work which will make sure that Somalia meets its commitments and that it's also living within its means as well. And if Somalia can succeed on the staff monitored programme, then what that means is that it'll have institutions and clear processes in place which are much more transparent and much clearer, and it can then borrow off the international. So first of all, it's then open for debt relief and debt cancellation, but also it can then borrow from the international financial markets for the things that really cost money and that donors like the UK and the US can't afford. So building roads where it costs 100 million per kilometre or per mile, where you need to borrow that sort of money and have that sort of international investment. So it's a really good piece of news about where Somalia is going, but there's a long way to go to make sure we get there. So I hope that bigger burden that the youth worry about won't be there, but I do think it's really important to look at the assets that Somalia's got now. So for example, having a resource sharing agreement so that if oil is found in commercial quantities, there isn't a resource curse and a fight over it, but there's a clear division on how the resource will be used across Somalia. To make sure that the justice systems work in terms of protecting property and the assets that Somalia has already got as well. And to make sure that where there are international commercial agreements or even local commercial agreements, those are transparent and accountable so that Somalia is getting the maximum revenue it can, which it can then invest back into its society and people. And going back to all of those questions that you've been asking, so it can afford to pay its army, so that it can show the peace dividend by investing in basic services, so it can welcome refugees, provide education, health, everything. It depends on a tax take and stability.
The question I have is, what is being done for Somali youth back home in Somalia to stop the cycle of poverty, whether it be education, employment opportunities? Because we find so much Somali youth, they go off to university, they get their education, yet they find it so hard to get those jobs. That is one of the main reasons why they come out and they try and flee Somalia and die on the sea, as we saw recently. So, and another main question I have is, Sagal, I believe, said that so much international aid is being given to Somalia, but yet how much of that international aid is being given to the youth of Somalia to end the cycle of poverty, seeing as the youth of Somalia will be the leaders of tomorrow?
The NGOs, international NGOs, having a lot of budget, 25 million, 12 million for different projects. Is that money alone to us, to Somalia, or is it a grant? If you have any information about that, please.
Thank you. Let's start.
Thanks so much. So two of you were asking about employment and in particular for youth. And just to say that is a really key feature of our DFID development programme. Whether it's looking at livestock markets, which are one of the biggest employers, regenerating on a smaller scale things like the fish market in Mogadishu, other ones outside, whether it's about putting in solar lighting because that means that trade can happen in the evening. Throughout the work that we're doing, we're specifically looking at whether there are employment opportunities. But I think DFID have got a really big programme which is focusing on youth employment and trying to maximise the opportunities for employment. The biggest thing that's going to help that though is having peace, and the more stability you have, the more investment you'll have, and the more the economy will burgeon and blossom, and that will create its own dividends as well. So we're doing what we can to try and create employment opportunities and education opportunities, but what we also need to do is to build the environment where that can flourish, and that's a really strong part of what we're doing. And just to say, where we have our development support, this is not a loan. This is something that we are giving and support that we're providing to Somalia to help it become a better place. and if you like, it's an investment, and that the return on that investment is the Somalia that flourishes, and that becomes a positive example in the region for peace.
I think you've had a lot of hard questions. I want to ask you a nice question, and that is, what was your favorite dish while you were in Somalia?
And the most important question is about my favorite food, right? So there's someone who posts food photos of Somali food, and I'm always looking at them because I love Somali culture and I love Somali food. Okay. So the thing that I have started doing is I now eat banana with my rice. So there are lots of things I really love. The curry, the watermelon juice is delicious.
Curry,
and before I went, my Somali teacher's wife would make me dishes. So I really liked ambulo. But my favourite is the banana with the main meal, and I even did it last week with my parents, and they looked at me and they thought I was crazy.
At the back of that note, how optimistic are you, Somalia, and in coming years will stand about its feet?
Look, I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist by nature, and I think you have to be to be in Somalia. But what I have seen is that there are lots of daily challenges, security challenges. You lose people that you know well and respect and love, and you see things that really frustrate you. But at the same time, I've been in Somalia now for a year, and in that time I've seen so much progress, and most of all, I've met amazing Somalis like you here, but in Mogadishu as well, who are determined to make Somalia a success. And if you have that determination and the courage, then you can do it. So I'm an optimist.
Ambassador Harriet Mathews, thank you very much for being on Universal TV. Thank you. Thank you very much. idinkoo dhan aad baa mahadsantiin. Intaa waxaa ku eeg barnaamijkii Friends of Somalia oo maanta ambassadoradu ay marti noogu ahayd aqoon-yahaniin, suxufiyiin, business people iyo weliba arday bright ah oo aan aad iyo aad ugu faraxsanahay. Thank you very much. Waa ku mahadsantiin daawashadiina.